Everyone. Can never remember if this is the last day of summer or the first day of fall, but it's a beautiful day here in Durham, and I'm very glad to be able to welcome you to our AGS event tonight with Laura Rosenberger, preparing for threats to the 2020 election. And before I give her bio, just want to say greetings to Laura.
Thank you for having me. Really sorry I can't be there in person with all of you, but really glad to be joining you this way.
Well, I think we tried to get you earlier in the year, but now here we are much closer to the election. So
yep,
a lot of our events this fall so far have had a ripped from the headlines kind of feel to it, and this one certainly does as well. But let me tell the audience a few words about Laura. Currently, she's a director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. And before she came to that position, she was a foreign policy advisor for Hillary for America, where she coordinated the development of the campaign's national security policies and messaging strategy. And prior to that, she served in a range of positions in the State Department and the National Security Council. She was Deputy Chief of Staff to Deputy Secretary of State Tony Blinken, a key person in the current Biden national security campaign. And then as Deputy National Security Advisor to Blinken's senior advisor, she counseled on the range of national security policies. We were also just discussing she's a China and Asia and also Korea policy expert. I don't know if we'll have a chance to get to that. Sometimes, we only have her for a little while. So she's got a range of expertise, and we're thrilled to have her. So actually, I thought maybe we'd start off by just tell everybody a little bit about what is the Alliance for Securing Democracy, how did it come about, and very importantly, is this something that Duke students might be able to do a virtual internship with this summer?
Let's get to practical points here.
Oh, absolutely. We're all about pragmatics.
Totally. I love it. I love it. Great. Well, again, thanks for letting me join you this way. I think we actually did have plans for me to come down there late March or early April, right?
Okay.
Everything was cascading down, and I remember, it was that time where we thought, is this going to be 2 weeks, and might we be able to pull this off? And well, here we are. So, but as you noted, David, I think this couldn't be a more timely topic. And it's a rapid moving one. So just to give you a sense of what the Alliance for Securing Democracy is and what we do. It's a bipartisan and transatlantic program that started in 2017. I co-founded it with a Republican colleague of mine who had been the foreign policy advisor to Senator Marco Rubio, including on his campaign. And the two of us really felt that we as a national security community had not quite yet gotten our hands around the range of asymmetric, below the threshold tools that authoritarian regimes in particular are using to attack democracies. Not to attack physical structures, sometimes using cyber means to attack in the digital space, but the ultimate end goal of these operations is to undermine and weaken our democratic institutions, including elections. And this includes things like information operations, of course, cyber attacks, as I mentioned, but also things like what we call malign financial influence, or what some call weaponized corruption, really using covert and non-transparent financial tools in order to influence or interfere in campaigns or politics, economic coercion at a strategic level, and the exploitation of certain political and social groups. And these tools take advantage of oftentimes new and emerging technologies, whether that's social media platforms, whether that's machine learning techniques and AI. But we see a real shift in the competitive spaces between democracies and autocracies. And I am of the belief that we are engaged in a systems competition between democracies and autocracies. And I think that a lot of that competition is playing out on new and different battlefields where, frankly, our autocratic competitors have been faster to figure out how to take advantage of them for their own power and influence, and democracies are coming from behind. So the Alliance for Securing Democracy was basically founded to be able to develop the skill set, the analytic capacity, the policy frameworks to really address these tools and tactics in a meaningful way. And the team is now 21 people on 2 continents with a range of expertise, both regional, on Russia, China, Iran, as well as functional across that full issue set that I laid out. And we believe that this integrated approach to understanding how all these pieces fit together and are used to interfere in our democracy, including, and most relevant today's conversation, in and around our elections, how we as democracies can actually begin to build resilience and counter these efforts.
Well, that's a great overview, and I want to confess that in preparing and thinking about this issue in my own knowledge, I've thought a lot about the information operations and the hacking. Some of the other things that you mentioned are things I don't know about, and I hope if my questions don't go there, you explain some of these covert financial tools and how they're being used, because that sounds really interesting. I want to kind of get to the present day first, but I also want to make sure we're kind of all on the same playing field here. So, if you don't follow this on a day-to-day basis, and the problem is that, the whole issue's become so politicized, it's hard to sort out what is spin and what do we know. So if you could just take us back to the 2016 election and just to kind of give everybody a sense of what is it that we know happened with Russia and the 2016 election. Of course, there's been hundreds and hundreds of page reports written, so it's a tough task to do it concisely. And if you could also just, when you're doing that, just if you could help us distinguish between, what I would say different categories of activities, the information operations, things that were happening in social media to try to bring certain issues to the fray or to divide Americans on partisan lines, and then the direct hacking activities that we know took place in the DNC and other targets. Just if we could remind us, I think that would be a helpful place to start.
Yeah, absolutely, David. I think it's important because as much as 2016 was only a few years ago, I think there's a big swirl that not only in pandemic times, right, that sort of makes everything run together, but there's so many different dimensions to the Russian operations in 2016 that I do think it's useful to break them down. So I'd say there were sort of 4 main components to the operations, and we know this. I'm drawing here on the findings of the intelligence community assessment released in January of 2017, to the Mueller report, which looked at certain aspects of these operations, as well as the 5-volume Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, a bipartisan series of reports that looked into Russian operations in the 2016 election. And the main components that come through in those are, first, the information operations, as David just mentioned. This was primarily the use of social media to manipulate democratic debates and divide Americans against one another. A lot of this took place on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the sort of well-known social media platforms. However, there's actually been evidence of operations by Russian actors across pretty much every known social media platform at this point in time. So I think it's important that we bear in mind that these smaller platforms also play a role here. A lot of those operations had a few particular goals. One was, as I noted, to really divide Americans. So in particular, a lot of really, what we would sort of shorthand as quote unquote hot button issues, right? So immigration was a big one in 2016. Questions of race were a really big one in 2016. And we often saw actually Russian actors on social media creating false personas or fake groups, organized under the pretense of being Americans, except they weren't, to organize Americans and heat up emotions on both sides of an issue. So it wasn't that they were trying to drive one ideological viewpoint. They were really trying to just essentially turn up the heat and pit Americans against each other. There is one other piece, though, of that social media operation that I think doesn't get discussed enough that is a really important one, and that's the voter suppression aspect. There were a number of different efforts, particularly targeting African-American voters, that were aimed at suppressing the votes, basically convincing people that it was not worth them turning out at all. And I think that is a particularly pernicious aspect of these operations. They're often thought of in terms of, well, did they convince somebody to vote a different way or whatnot? But I think a lot of the content that we saw there was actually aimed at convincing people that they simply should stay home. And I think that's particularly problematic when it comes to elections. So that's the social media bucket, to really compress it. The second bucket is cyber operations that were targeting campaign and campaign-related infrastructure. So David, you noted the DNC hack. There was also, of course, hacking into a number of different Clinton campaign aides' email accounts, including campaign chair John Podesta. And then the weaponization and public release of the information from those hacks, right, in order to create a certain kind of effect. And the predominant goal in those hacks was essentially to do two things. One, to divide Democrats from one another and to undermine confidence in the nominating process that made Hillary Clinton the nominee. And the second was really to just denigrate Hillary Clinton and sort of feed into preconceived notions and other kinds of conceptions about her and those around her. The third is also using cyber tools. Was actually aimed at election infrastructure. And I think it's important to bear in mind here that election infrastructure is more than just voting machines. So voting machines are definitely part of this, but election infrastructure also involves voter rolls, voter databases. So when you show up to the polls and your name is on a list and somebody checks that you are in fact registered to vote there, as well as vote reporting systems. So actually the systems used to both tally votes and to publicly report out those votes. We now know that there were probes on all 50 states' election systems or election-related systems. We also know that in several states, including Florida, there were actual intrusions into parts of election infrastructure. However, I think it's really important to note here that there is absolutely no evidence, and trust me, people have looked really hard, that any votes were actually changed or manipulated. And so I think that's really, really important to understand on this point. The fourth piece of this is that there were a suite of activities. For those who've read the Mueller report, this would have been Mueller Report Volume 2, that sought to, in one way or another, use interactions with campaign aides or people close to the campaign in order to somehow provide assistance to them. So this falls in the category of things that we would either categorize as non-monetary assistance from a foreign actor, which is illegal under US law, although there are some big loopholes in those laws that I would argue should be addressed. As well as, in some instances, the potential use of outside organizations to engage in some sorts of influence peddling. So the most well-known case here involves a Russian agent who was working on behalf of a very senior Russian oligarch to use the NRA in order to cultivate ties with and curry favor with certain candidates and campaigns. So those are the four main buckets, and Robert Mueller described those as constituting essentially a sweeping and systematic effort to interfere in and undermine American democracy.
Wow, that's a tour de force and just exactly what I was hoping you would do, because that helps us very much to break these down. And you already anticipated my question about voting infrastructure. Because that is very important, and we'll come back to that when we talk about today's election. Let me kind of start from first principles, though, about this whole, if you look at this whole suite of activities, I want to give you a chance to explain what makes it kind of different or extraordinary. You know, the United States has been interested in elections in other countries for many years. We've used the CIA to try to influence political outcomes. and so on. I'm not saying in most recent years, but it's definitely part of our history. So lots of countries have interest in how elections and how elections come out in other countries. So what is it that makes this particular set of activities jump out from a historical perspective to you as being different, extraordinary, a new chapter in countries trying to influence each other, which they all are doing? That's what international relations is, right? So explain why this is extraordinary and extraordinary troublesome enough to you to set up a whole organization to address.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to start with the point that you just made there, which I think is a really important one, which is, and it's one that I make quite often, actually. I mean, nations do influence. Like, that is the business of international relations. It's influence. And there's nothing wrong with influence per se, right? And there's many different ways of doing influence. And, Joe Nye famously talked about, soft power is one form of influence as opposed to hard power. I have colleagues at the National Endowment for Democracy who've coined a term, sharp power, to talk about some of the kinds of activities that I'm talking about today, these more coercive, some would call them malign influence activities, that really fall outside of the scope of what's generally accepted to be, nation state conduct. Excuse me. I think there's a couple of things that make activities fall outside of that normal acceptable boundary of nation state influence. The first is that these activities are broadly covert and non-transparent. Excuse me.
If you need to get some water, by all means.
I'm good. They are generally aimed at sort of weakening and undermining countries from within using covert and non-transparent means. And I think that is very different than the sorts of open influence that we see nation states around the world doing and have historically done.
So just to go back to your old boss, or at least your campaign boss, Putin said that Hillary Clinton was trying to undermine him by statements that she made about democracy and so on during an election or a run up to an election in Russia. And he justified in some ways, I mean, he never admitted to doing any of this, but he certainly justified the idea of Russia trying to, essentially repay the favor. But that's what the difference is, because that was totally overt.
Precisely, exactly, right? That was a totally overt statement. And I think that's where, U.S. democracy support is fundamentally, I actually see it as completely oppositional to what we see from Russia, right? U.S. democracy support is aimed at building up and supporting institutions, right? It's not about particular candidates. It's about supporting the process and supporting the people's role in the process. It's done openly and transparently. Whereas the kinds of things we're talking about are covert and they are intended on weakening democratic institutions. Now, you rightly noted, David, that in the past and during the Cold War, the U.S. did conduct some operations that many would believe by today's standards of democracies to be things we shouldn't do. I have a colleague who actually just wrote a book that looks at the history of both U.S. and then Soviet, now Russian, political interference operations. It's called Rigged. And he takes a look at all of the historical cases using some fascinating CIA records and a real wealth of interviews with former intelligence officials. And his findings are that even when the U.S. was engaged in these kinds of operations in the past, and I want to be clear, this is not me excusing them, because I do not think the U.S. should be engaged in operations that aim at trying to tip the scales. But even when the U.S. was doing those things, he found that it actually still was done through the democratic process, whereas the Soviet efforts were always basically done counter to the democratic process. And so that's an interesting finding to me. But I think the bottom line is the U.S. at the end of the Cold War decided that, hey, we're not playing these games anymore. The Cold War is over, and the U.S. should get out of this business. It's fundamentally undemocratic. And so the U.S. doesn't engage in those kinds of operations anymore. And I would argue the U.S. And any democracy shouldn't, because I do think that, you know, it's appropriate to be engaged in the overt space, where our interests are clear, where we're transparent on our activities, and where we are firmly aimed at bolstering institutions, not particular individuals.
Okay, so let's move forward from what we now know. We think we know at least what happened in 2016, and go through the, you know, what the Trump administration has been doing with regard. And I think I'm not making a partisan point when I say there's been a lot of mixed messages on this issue, with the president, of course, calling the whole thing a hoax and so on. Where on the other hand, the intelligence community and the FBI actually taking some actions to try to address and prevent this from happening again. In Congress, Mitch McConnell not allowing legislation and things to move forward, and then on the other hand, certain sanctions being put in place on Russia. So again, if you could use your powers of synthesis, if you could kind of explain to people what has been the set of responses that the United States government has made to these 4 buckets of actions that took place in the 2016 election.
Sure. Well, I'll actually start by noting that I will address the U.S. government role here, but this is an issue set where the U.S. government is not the only important actor, right? There's a number of actors, whether that's social media platforms or state and local election officials or the makers of voting infrastructure, that are.
Well, I think we should probably try to hit on all of those. So that would be fine if you can do it. Yeah.
All right, great. In a concise way. So let's start with the U.S. government, right? So I'd say a few things. One, the good news is that the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, just a big mouthful right there. They call it CISA, so we'll go with that. CISA has the mandate for defending a significant amount of cyber infrastructure, and they have done, with too few resources, a really, really good job at working with state and local officials. Because in the U.S. system, it's actually the states that run elections, and in many cases, states devolve it to local jurisdictions. To better bolster the resilience of our election infrastructure. And I will tell you that I have a lot of confidence in our election infrastructure. That doesn't mean that actors might not try, but in terms of the ability to actually penetrate it, I have a lot of confidence that that's going to be really difficult. And in fact, the intelligence community in a statement a few weeks ago noted that it remains extremely difficult or unlikely, I can't remember the precise word off the top of my head, to manipulate votes at scale. And so I think it's really important to bear that in mind. And CISA has done that through a few different means. One is, this is going to sound really like boring and technocratic, but sometimes this stuff really matters. So they've, in addition to working with states to sort of help them think about what are the most secure election systems to be using, they've also done things like deploying something called Albert sensors, which are these sensors that sit on networks that can monitor traffic to basically be able to detect very quickly any unusual activity. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, detecting it more quickly, but we didn't have these in 2016 to defend these networks. These networks since 2016 have been identified as critical infrastructure, which they weren't before. And that provides a whole different framework for resources and other kinds of efforts that can be deployed to better secure and defend this infrastructure. And these sensors will help ensure that, while it took nearly 2 years to be able to put together the pieces of what had in fact happened with respect to cyber intrusions on election infrastructure in 2016, we will have real-time visibility into that now. And that's really important when it comes to ensuring the integrity of the elections, right? That nobody doubts whether there was any intrusions. So that's a really big deal. The other sort of technocratic thing that's hugely important here is getting security clearances to the right officials in state and local jurisdictions, mostly state jurisdictions. In 2016, the federal government didn't have people in power who could actually do something with that information in the states that they could share threat information with. And that's a really big deal. You want to be able to alert people who can actually do something about it when you see something, right? And so that has now happened, which is good news. On the social media front, obviously here the platforms themselves play a particular role. And we've gone from denial of the problem to admitting there's a problem to doing some things about the problem. I don't think we're doing nearly enough about the problem. The platforms have put in place some policies that do address the manipulation of their platforms by foreign actors. In fact, Facebook just today announced the removal of a couple of networks, including one targeting the US from China, very interestingly. That, they really are beginning to take some action on these issues. The other thing I think that's important from the US government perspective that we've seen is much more effort to share information between law enforcement or the intelligence community and the platforms. So for instance, a few weeks ago, both Facebook and Twitter removed a network of Russian accounts that were trying to manipulate debate in the United States around political issues. In this case, they were actually trying to depress turnout on the left by denigrating Joe Biden. And they were able to do that based on a tip from the FBI. And that kind of information sharing is not something that we would have seen in the past. So that's a really important thing. When it comes to campaigns, and the cyber intrusions on campaigns, I think candidates and campaigns have taken this threat much more seriously now. It's known as a threat in a way it wasn't known in 2016 or anticipated at least in 2016. The government has kind of a small role in that, and it's something that there's been different pieces of legislation trying to figure out if there's a way that the government could protect those systems, but it gets complicated because you don't want the government too involved in anything that involves sensitive information flowing through campaign networks, right? But I think on that front we've seen some progress. On the questions about like the offering of assistance, whether financial or non-financial, to campaigns and candidates, we've seen very little progress on that. Proposals in Congress for legislation that would close gaps and loopholes have just died on the vine. The Federal Election Commission, which has some jurisdiction over this, has basically been defunct for a variety of reasons from the better part of the last few years. So that really has not gone anywhere. That's the good news. Do you want the bad news too, David, or were you going to come back to that?
Well, the bad news, not in terms of things that haven't been done, that would be great. Bad news in terms of like what is happening, I'm saving that for the next question.
All right, bad news in terms of what hasn't been done, really briefly. There have been dozens of pieces of legislation introduced on a bipartisan basis in Congress over the past few years, including legislation that would have provided significant additional resources to the states for election security measures, providing standards for best practices for cybersecurity of election infrastructure, legislation that would require reporting certain kinds of contacts from foreign officials that appears to be aimed at influencing an election, legislation that would actually require political advertising online to be treated the same way as it is offline, which is important because, as some may remember, the Russians, as part of their social media campaign, actually purchased political ads using rubles from St. Petersburg, and nobody asked a question. And so all of those things have been just sitting, on the floor of Congress. As much as I want to deeply credit the work of the intelligence community and the FBI and CISA for the efforts that, these very hardworking, dedicated people have been doing, as you noted at the top, David, the issue of foreign interference has become so politicized. And unfortunately, we see the commander-in-chief himself using foreign interference as a political weapon, either calling it a hoax or manipulating intelligence about ongoing interference activities as a political weapon against his opponents. And so I think that is deeply damaging, because for a problem that requires building societal resilience, that requires, really bringing together cross-sectoral cooperation in new and meaningful ways, you can't do that when you don't have leadership on the issue from the top, not to mention the signal that sends to our adversaries, right? When you have the commander-in-chief essentially signaling that, all bets are off and it's open season on these issues to attack American democracy, that really leaves us extraordinarily vulnerable.
Okay, well, excellent summary there. Let's go to right now and try to give everybody a sense of, given the protections, but the business that was not completed. So we're in a better position, as I get a sense from you, than we were in 2016. But there's a lot more that could have been done that hasn't. I wonder if you can give us a picture of what we're seeing now. And I was thought, with your permission, we would look at a really interesting tool that you have. This is going to require me to use my Zoom skills. Bear with me for a sec. We do that. And we go back to Zoom. And we share. And there it is. And let's see. Okay. And this is something your organization calls Hamilton, right? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what I'm looking at.
Yeah, well, this is the Hamilton 68 dashboard. And David, I don't know if you might want to scroll down there a little bit so you can see some of the data.
Okay. Right there? Or further?
It's not. On my screen, I don't actually see it scrolling. I just see the header at the top. I don't know what others see.
Okay, well, let me try again.
Okay, well, while you do that, I'll describe what it is. First of all, a bit of history on the name. Foreign interference in our democracy may seem like a concern that's really come to the fore just in the past few years. But in fact, this was a significant concern for the founding fathers. To the extent that Hamilton in Federalist 68, there we go, that's better. Hamilton in Federalist number 68 actually talked about the threat of foreign interference to our democracy and why it would be just so destructive. So as a tribute to him and the long history of understanding of why it belongs to the American people to decide their leaders, not to foreign powers, we sort of named the dashboard that way. What the dashboard shows, and it's this is the second incarnation of it that we've had since we launched. The dashboard looks at the overt messaging that we see from state-backed media, as well as state and in some countries party officials that are being propagated across the number of different dimensions. So Twitter is one big place that we grab data from. Another is broadcasts from state media networks. And we also grab some website traffic here. And we track content from Russia, from China, and from Iran. And I believe right now, yeah, we're looking at the Russia data right now. And what this does is it gives us a sense of the messaging, the narrative content. Can you hear me still, David?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. You're doing great.
Oh, great. You just disappeared on me. So it must just be something on my monitor. So I'm just going to keep going. It tracks the overt messaging that we see. And what that allows us to do is understand a little bit of what, again, from the overt perspective, the intentions of these actors, and be able to then map that against some data that we have with some partners on what we see happening in the more gray or covert spaces, to be able to understand where certain narratives are originating, how they're being driven. We can see here where outlets like RT, for instance, formerly called Russia Today, are amplifying certain narratives that we see originating from domestic outlets in the United States. So it gives us a good sort of, temperature reading, essentially, of what we see happening, again, in this overt space that we can then use to dive deeper for some of our research on the more gray and covert activities.
What are these purple lines on this graph kind of tell us? Is this in terms of the different countries and the comparisons, and why is the United States represented on the second bar of that graph?
So for some reason, I've like completely lost my video here. So you're gonna have to just bear with me. I am sorry, technical difficulties, but you can still.
Well, maybe it has something to do with sharing during a webinar. So anyway, I thought that was a really interesting website, and I think students will really enjoy, maybe who are interested in this, going and digging in themselves. But I'll stop the share. Hopefully that.
I got my screen back, so I don't know what happened there, but yeah, sorry about that. But
somehow I might have been muted. I got myself muted as well. So anyway, that was a good experiment in Zooming, but maybe one we won't repeat again. I think it's we're getting to the time where we're going to ask for students to chime in, and but why don't we just kind of finish up our section by, so there's the dashboard that's showing it, but what are we seeing that's either different or more sophisticated, or what are, to the extent, or is it the same, or just a replay of 2016, or what are these state actors doing that we're seeing in 2020 that is worrying you and differently?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a few things are different. You mentioned earlier, the sense that maybe we're better off since 2016, at least in terms of preparedness. I think that might be true on like the actual policy preparedness side. On the flip side, I actually think that to the extent that these operations exploit domestic vulnerabilities, I actually think we are more vulnerable today because of how polluted our information environment has become, and because of the absolute, just what I would call debilitating partisanship that pervades every aspect of our political debates. This makes us extraordinarily vulnerable to these operations. And so if you'll bear with me through a metaphor here, I think in 2016, there was some really, really dry tinder and maybe a couple of sparks that the Russians were able to, build into light into a fire. And they have continued to fuel that fire a little bit over the years, but the fire has really, really grown, and it's become a pretty consuming blaze. And at this point, the Russian operations are really most of these foreign actors, and they do have slightly different goals, but they don't really need to actually do much because the fire is raging. What we mostly see is essentially what I call a little bit of squirting of accelerant around the edges, essentially to direct the fire in one way or another, right? It's like, I want to burn that town over there. I want to really hit on this hot button issue. I want to drive this particular narrative to a very, very specific end. And that is more of what we see now. It's the injection, not necessarily using broad-based kind of social media efforts like we saw in 2016, but much more pointed efforts to try to drive very particular narratives in order to influence particular target groups or audiences. And those operations can be a little harder to detect. The good news is they tend to be hitting a smaller audience. And so we don't necessarily see the broad-based stuff that we did in 2016. We do know that the Treasury Department a few weeks ago actually designated several Russian and Russian-linked individuals for ongoing efforts to interfere in the 2020 election. Several of them were affiliated with the Internet Research Agency, which is most well known as the St. Petersburg troll farm that ran most of the social media operations. But one of them was a Ukrainian parliamentarian, pro-Russian, actually named in the Treasury designation as being a Russian agent, named Andrei Derkach. And the designation for him basically said that he was attempting to actually launder weaponized information into the US political system, including, we know from other reporting, through members of Congress, in order to create investigations into and denigrate the candidacy of Joe Biden. And so we know that those kinds of things are also happening from the Russia perspective. The Director of National Intelligence and his offices have named also China and Iran as two threats that they are concerned about. However, their reporting on China has indicated that while China is engaged in ongoing efforts to criticize US policy through social media operations and information operations and otherwise, denigrate democracy, that China seems to still be, deciding whether or not to actually engage in anything active in the election. I will note that the Facebook takedown that I mentioned earlier today, that happened earlier today, actually did involve a Chinese network that was engaging mostly outside of the United States. But interestingly, did seem to be what I would call testing out tactics in the United States that were actually aimed at playing both sides. So there was some efforts that were aimed at boosting Joe Biden. There were some efforts that were seen to be boosting President Trump. And so, but I think it's important to note those were very small scale operations and didn't seem to be actually aimed at doing anything significant, but were probably rather, the Chinese individuals, and they were not linked to, they were not attributed to the government. Testing out tactics. But, China's doing lots of stuff in this sort of ongoing malign influence space, separate and apart from elections. Iran is a little bit of a muddier picture, but I think the bottom line is that while Iran has tested out sort of social media manipulation and tested out some of its cyber capabilities, that Iran doesn't seem to have either the significant capabilities or really intentions or motivation to interfere in a significant way in the actual elections.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I want to welcome students to participate by using the Zoom raise your hand function, and we will recognize you. And all of you should be thinking hard about questions. And while you do, I'm going to give Laura a chance to have a drink of water and make some announcements. Of course, first of all, to thank AGS staff, Melanie and Beth, for helping put this event together today, as always. But a couple of upcoming events. A week from today, Tuesday, September 29th at 5:30, we'll have Robert Zellick here to discuss America in the World, a history of U.S. diplomatic and foreign policy, which I believe is the title of his upcoming book or new book. And this will be moderated by our friend, AGS professor, Bruce Jentelson, jack of all things foreign policy and U.S. diplomacy here at Duke and many other places. So we're looking forward to Bruce and Bob Zellick next Tuesday. We will be having our first event of the Focus on Israel Speaker series, which we've done for a number of years now. A conversation with Ambassador Michael Oren, Israel ambassador to the United States. And that will be on Thursday, October 1st at noon to account for the time difference with Israel, where he is. You'll need to register for that one, and space is limited, so please, our folks who are interested in Israel issues, please do that. On October 8th to 10th, we are hosting a simulation, a day and a half simulation game that's being put on by Valens Global. It's going to involve issues relating to, without giving away too much, international relations and diplomacy problem resulting from the COVID-19 crisis. We have limited space, so students should really sign up if they want to participate. And it will require a couple hours on Thursday evening, October 8th, another couple hours at some point on October 9th that you work on with your team, and we'll wrap up Saturday morning at 2:30 p.m. So it is a time commitment, but it's going to be something different and fun, and I think it's going to be very, very professionally put on. So I'd encourage all of our students to please sign up for that. It's going to be first come, first serve. If you want more information regarding AGS events, or you want to sign up for our newsletter, please visit our website, ags.duke.edu. You can email Melanie Benson or use a link that is now being posted on our chat, as has been a place to sign up for the exercise. Excellent. With that, I think we have a question from Ash.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Great.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us. I just had, I was looking for some clarification. I was, reading the news the other day and heard something about, how there were allegations that the Mueller report was somehow suppressed or things of that nature. I was wondering if you could give me any sort of update on that. Is that true? And, what's the response to that looking like?
Thanks. I obviously can't provide any particular insight into whether or not, those allegations are true. My understanding is that's coming from reporting out of a new book from one of the people on the Mueller team. I unfortunately am not really in a position to be able to shed any light beyond what you've probably read in the reporting on that. What I will say that I think is important for us to bear in mind here, and I say this as an institutionalist and without comment particularly on the allegations in that report, but I do think that a careful reading of the Mueller report indicates a belief that the powers of the Justice Department end at one point and begin at another with Congress, and that there was a sense from Mueller in the way that he wrote the report that the report was going to be taken up for certain kinds of actions by Congress, possibly to include impeachment proceedings. That obviously didn't happen. Of course, we did proceed to impeachment proceedings, but not on the basis of the Mueller report, on the basis of other activities. And so I will say that, again, without commenting on the allegations that are in that particular report, because again, I have no personal insights beyond what's there, I do think that one of the things we've seen over the past few years is that our institutions in numerous places aren't functioning the way they're supposed to. And I do think it's important that as we think about the multitude of challenges to our democracy that we're seeing from foreign actors as well as from some figures in our own political system, that we are oriented around how to restore normative order and the role of institutions, because I think that at the end of the day, that's actually what's under attack from these foreign actors. And we need to understand how we actually bolster those institutional processes. So sorry if that's not a really satisfactory answer to your precise question, but hopefully at least gets at some of the issues raised there.
Okay, our next question comes from Elise.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming. This has been an extremely informative talk. I was wondering, we have all these different measures in the United States that you and other people that are doing similar work have discussed for bolstering election security and preventing foreign interference from hostile actors. What role do you think the US government should be playing, and non-governmental organizations and the private sector within the US, in coordinating with our allies who are facing similar challenges? In particular, countries that do not have the same kind of infrastructural advantages that the US does. So I'm thinking namely of Ukraine and other countries in Eastern Europe.
Thanks, Elise. It's a really, really important question. And I was negligent in not mentioning the role of our allies and multilateralism in this. You're absolutely right that this is a shared threat, that, in the US, I think we have a tendency to think of ourselves as exceptional and therefore problems are unique to us. When in fact, many of us would argue that we probably should have been paying a little more attention to some of the Russian operations targeting our democratic allies in the early 2010s to get a better warning sign of what may come our way. So I think there's a few different things that we should be doing with our democratic partners and allies. The first is, I think we need to be much better about sharing information. We are all facing very similar threats from many times the same actor. But these tactics evolve very quickly. And I think we need to be doing a much better job in a much more systematic way of sharing the threat reporting picture here. Sometimes there's a hesitancy to do that because in many instances, these are operations that are hitting on very sensitive issues in our domestic politics. But I think as democracies, we've got to be able to sort of get over that hump and be willing to, open up some of our more sensitive conversations in order to collectively defend ourselves. And I don't mean collective defense there in the actual, more technical level of that term. But I do mean that we need to be thinking about this problem as a shared one in that way. The second piece, as you rightly mentioned, is the sort of resilience and capacity building piece. How can we be doing more to support our democratic partners and allies who don't have the same capacity in this space that we do? And I think there's a few different pieces here. One is sharing best practices, right? So we talked about the sharing threat information, but similarly, I think we need to be doing a better job of sharing with one another what works, what doesn't, in what circumstances, against what actors. But I think that we also need to be providing resources to our partners and allies to better bolster their own defenses, to be able to build resilience within their own systems. In Ukraine, for instance, we've done a lot of this when it comes to anti-corruption and the vulnerability of the Ukrainian system to the kind of covert or non-transparent financial influence that I mentioned earlier. When it comes to information operations, actually in some ways, there's a good bit we can be learning. Many of us have learned a good bit from Ukrainian civil society actors over the past few years, where we've seen pretty robust efforts by Ukrainian citizens to stand up non-government organizations that are aimed at bolstering their own information space. I think the third piece that we need to be doing a better job on is actually coordinating responses to these activities, right? So when we've seen interference operations, in general, it's sort of the country affected responds on its own unilaterally. And in general, in foreign policy, and that is not an effective approach at actually imposing costs, right? Thinking about how we can bring more countries to the table to actually be imposing costs is a really important thing. Now, again, I'm not talking about sort of collective defense sort of arrangements, but I do think that if we can look at the kinds of coordinated actions that we saw, for instance, following the Russian military intelligence operation poisoning Sergei Skripal and his daughter in the UK a few years ago, where a number of different countries took action to impose costs and sanctions and other sorts of retaliatory measures against Russia. I think we need to be thinking about that sort of strategy in a more sophisticated way across the election and other sorts of foreign interference tactics.
Okay, well, we've got a lot of questions lined up, so we'll try to get to all of
Right,
them.
I'll try and shorten my answers so we can get through more.
Ask our guests to have a little shorter answers would be fantastic. So I think we're going to Jimmy. It'd be Jimmy Toscano, I think, was first.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming again. I think this is a really timely and, super interesting issue. My question is coming from the perspective of someone who, in his spare time does try to influence American elections, although I think in hopefully a more benign way than what we've been discussing today. But I've found it to be really difficult to get people to vote, to convince them of things, to all this kind of stuff. So my question, and you've touched on this a little bit, but is this an effective use of resources of foreign actors to be trying to influence our elections in this way? And is it easier, to kind of sow chaos and doubt and those kind of things and, reduce faith in the system versus trying to, get people to participate in the system in the way it's meant to work? And so and thank you so much again for.
Yeah, I had a question like that I was thinking of as well. I mean, each of these campaigns is going to have, by the time is all said and done, $1 billion+ that they're putting out there. So how, just to add to what Jimmy was asking, how much of this other stuff is just a little kind of noise and a little bit of noise and a cacophony of messages that are out there?
Yeah, I think it's great questions. And I would just maybe back up one step to talk about what the goals of these operations are. I mean, I think it's very natural to think about the goal of foreign interference operations and election interference as being about helping one candidate or another. And certainly that can be a part of the strategy. But for instance, if we look at the intelligence community assessment of Russia's 2016 operations, it found that Russia had three goals there. The first was to denigrate Hillary Clinton, to weaken her as a candidate and potentially as a president if she were elected. The second was to help the candidacy of Donald Trump. But the third actually was to weaken Americans' faith in the election itself, right? To weaken our faith in democratic institutions. And I actually think that we forget a lot about that last goal. But from the perspective of Russian actors, certainly, and to a slightly lesser degree, some of the other foreign actors we see in this space, that goal of essentially having us lose faith in our democracy, in the integrity of our election, which is such a foundational institution in our democracy, that is actually the goal. In fact, FBI Director Chris Wray testified before Congress last week that he thinks this is the greatest threat to our election, that we will lose faith in our electoral process because of the ongoing disinformation and cyber attacks that have come to light. And that is actually, I think, a more significant national security concern than even affecting the outcome of an election. If we no longer believe that elections have integrity, then it doesn't really matter who is said to have won or lost. And so while I think that you are right, that it is extremely difficult to influence people to vote one way or another, I would say a few things. One, it's easier to convince them not to vote than to vote. And two, it is your point about sowing chaos, right? Is it easier to just sow chaos and to kind of reap destruction? I think is very much part and parcel of the goals of these actors. And at the end of the day, my greatest concern is very similar to Director Wray's, that our fear of foreign interference, or the perception of it, will actually cause us to lose faith in our democracy. I think that's something we really have to guard against.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you, Jimmy. How about Jen Alexander?
Hello, thank you. I had two questions that I was debating between, and one was very close to Jimmy, so thank you, Jimmy, for asking that one. The other was, I was wondering if you could speak to what it looks like to see disinformation campaigns on YouTube and what it looks like to solve those. I'm familiar with the platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, where it's very short, sweet, not sweet, but and I don't know what disinformation would even look like on that completely different platform of YouTube and how you would fix it.
It's a great question. So first, I'm going to commend to you, if you're interested in this topic, a New York Times podcast series called Rabbit Hole, which actually talks about social media as a radicalizing force and talks about YouTube as an example. And it goes beyond just questions of disinformation. It's talking a lot about sort of radicalization, including, for instance, like the Christchurch shooter, right? But it also talks about the role of conspiracy theories online and how people essentially fall down that rabbit hole. And so part of the thing with YouTube to get at one piece of this, I think your question's actually asking about the content. What does it look like? But I'll come to that in 1 second. The reason that YouTube has actually been such a significant force for the spawn of conspiracy theories and other sorts of disinformation is its algorithm, which has been changed over the past few years, so it's a little better than it used to be. But it's between both the autoplay feature, which basically just queues up, video after video after video after video without you actually doing anything there. But it was actually designed to continue to go down a more sort of radical path on whatever issue it was that you were clicking on videos on, right? And so it takes you pretty quickly down these rabbit holes of particular conspiracy theories, whether that's Pizzagate or QAnon or any of these other different, broad-based conspiracy theories out there. You see the similar thing happen on disinformation, as well as a few other things. So the YouTube channels have allowed state-backed outlets to be able to place content on YouTube ripped really directly often from their screens without labeling it as being state-backed. So for instance, for a long time, and again, this has gotten better, but if you went on YouTube and you Googled, for instance, the White Helmets, which are the humanitarian aid and civilian defense force that has really played a significant role in Syria, but is the subject of significant conspiracy theories pushed by Russians primarily, that they are a CIA-funded, extremist organization. If you went on YouTube and you Googled the White Helmets, much as if you Googled it on any Google platform, you would get served up a host of hoax videos and other kinds of content, basically trying to show you that the White Helmets are in fact this extremist group that's actually killing babies, not saving them. And so the content on YouTube can take any number of different forms. But what you wouldn't even see with that, White Helmet video, for instance, is that was, content essentially taken directly from Russian state media and put into your YouTube channel. And so the sourcing is hidden, as well as, again, the more sort of conspiratorial content. But as with YouTube videos, it can take any sort of different kinds of forms there to help actually create that broader impression of a lack of truth or web of conspiracies.
Okay, we are beginning to run out of time. We have 3 questioners remaining, and noting my guests' kind of inability to really shorten those answers a lot, I thought what we would do is let's let each of them get your pen ready. Let's ask each of them to ask their short question and see if you can kind of weave them into an answer, and then we'll kind of bring it to an end. So Let's hear first from Daniel, then Jimmy Kamar, and then Andrew Canfield.
Hi, thank you so much. I actually had a question about the Transatlantic Alliance, because I know that the German Marshall Fund is primarily working in that space. I was just going to ask about how optimistic are you about the impact that a Biden administration would have on strengthening that alliance, because I believe that there's quite a strong worry in Europe that the US is kind of pivoting to Southeast Asia. So do you think that that worry is warranted? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Jimmy. Go ahead, I think you're unmuted. Okay, let's try Andrew Canfield. Andrew, go ahead.
Hi, hello.
Yep, we can hear you.
So my question is, in your opinion, does the United States government have the capability or an organization that develops, directs, or shapes influence strategy for the whole of government operations, investments, and activities in the information environment that enables our country to respond cohesively to threats as election interference and impose costs on our adversaries? If yes, where is it? If no, what or where should it be? And what does it look like? Thank you for taking my question.
Okay, interesting one. Let's see, did we lose Jimmy Kamar? I think maybe we did. Okay, so we have the alliance and a where in the government, does this responsibility sit for trying to comprehensively respond?
Great, and these are both great questions. They're all great questions, which is why I can't give them just a tip of the hat. I'm sorry to not be able to be shorter on them. But first, on the question of the transatlantic relationship, I mean, I'm not in a position to necessarily speak for what a Biden administration would bring. But what I will say is a few things. The first is that the transatlantic relationship remains one of the most relationships that the United States has. And over the past few years, we have unfortunately neglected one of our greatest sources of strength, and that is our network of alliances. And so, whether it's to deal with challenges like the ones we're talking about today, other challenges in the digital domain, or frankly, whether it's to deal with China, I think that the transatlantic relationship has to be front and center in addressing all of those challenges. And so I have a really hard time imagining any strategy that doesn't put the transatlantic relationship front and center and really prioritize repairing it in a significant way. I also think that, I was actually in government during what was then called the Obama rebalance to Asia. And I think that there was a lot of anxiety at the time from our European partners that the U.S. was somehow moving away from Europe while investing more in Asia. And I guess I would say that my experience is that these things are not zero sum. I mean, there are certain parts of foreign policy and international relations that are zero sum. This is not one of them. And I don't think that the U.S. Deciding that it's going to invest more resources in one part of the world necessarily means less in others. So I think that, to my mind, the transatlantic relationship is just so core to every issue that we need to be dealing with today, and really are some of our best friends that we really need to invest there. My only concern, my biggest concern, I should say, is that, in the past 4 years, Europe, in some understandable ways, has decided it needs to go its own way on certain issues. And we've seen a divergence from the United States on some pretty important issues, including the digital space. And I worry that these are areas where we urgently need to get on the same page. And I hope that that we will actually be able to do that, and that the time hasn't passed. It's not too late to do that. On the excellent question on how the U.S. government is organized on these issues, the premise of your question is correct. There is not a sufficient structure or organization in the U.S. government at the moment to deal with these issues in an integrated way. And to your question of what should be done there, I would love ideas, because I have been trying to work on this very question for the better part of several years, and feel like I have a much better sense of what we shouldn't do than what we should do. But a couple of just principles that I think are important here. One is, we've got to work across the interagency on this issue set. We have to bring together, as your question noted, the sort of full suite of US government tools and powers to be able to deal with this challenge. But we also need to think about partners outside of government. And I believe strongly that any structure that's going to be sufficiently able to deal with this challenge has to build significant relationships into that structure with the private sector and with civil society actors, as we talked about earlier, who play really important roles here. And so I do think that we've got to think in an entirely new way about structural models to actually be engaging in these issues in a meaningful way, as you note, is so important.
Well, thank you for that. And yeah, I think the answer to the last question was it isn't, right?
Yeah.
And I'm also reminded of, in my area, the whole, when ISIS started essentially dominating the information space, and the question was, how to counter message. Different things got stood up, and I think, to make it, a complicated thing pretty simple, we found that the things that got stood up really didn't work all that well, like the messaging, counter-ISIS messaging department and the State Department really
Yep.
had a lot of problems. So very, very tough challenge that you're grappling with, and thank you. Well, as a student said, we couldn't have had a better treat and more insight into something that's really happening in real time, and also an understanding what's happened in the past. This has been just tremendously educational. I've enjoyed preparing for this event and learning about your work, and then listening to all of your answers. I wish we would be retiring to a nice conference room or room in a hotel for some hors d'oeuvres and some wine. Maybe in your next visit to Duke, we'll be able to treat you to that. In the meantime, since none of us are going to work, all of us need to up our t-shirt and home collection wardrobe, and so we will be sending you this Duke American Strategy t-shirt.
Lovely.
Many of your friends from the National Security Council, including Peter Feeber, but other friends of yours have these, and I'm sure wear them all the time.
I've jealously seen them and always wanted one, so I'm so grateful.
And I didn't tell you to say that during our pre-recording either, so thank you so much for saying that. And you're a friend of the program now. You've been initiated. You'll get the shirt. And
wonderful.
We're so grateful to you for the last for this hour and so. It's been very educational, and thank you to Laura. Thank you to everybody who tuned in, and we're adjourned for today until next week. Thanks again.
Thank you.